Good evening. I want to kind of call us to attention and get the project or the program. That's the word I'm looking for. Get the program started. My name is John Hallway. I am the executive director here of the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice. On behalf of my colleagues, many of whom are seated back here at, we'll call it table 7, and my colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, I want to thank you guys all for being here for our 2019 Exoneree Fellow Program entitled Coming Home, featuring Eugene Gilliard, the first Exoneree of the Pennsylvania Innocence Project. And we could not be happier to partner with the Innocence Project on this. We could not be happier to welcome Eugene and his wife here to be our guests. We're absolutely thrilled that he will have the opportunity, they will have the opportunity to share their story with you. And then we can talk about something that I think sometimes gets neglected in stories about exoneration, because I think there have been way too many exonerations in the United States. It's something I have to check actually daily. There's a website that I hope many of you know about called the National Registry of Exonerations, and the registry basically scours the national media for stories about exonerees and logs and compiles them. They found 2,414 confirmed cases where people have been exonerated of all of the charges against them in the United States since the advent of DNA testing. We're adding them at about a rate of 1 every other day, which is why I have to go back onto the website to check and see. And I'm sorry to say that adding them 1 every other day, what that means is actually we're getting better at finding them. It doesn't mean that fewer of them are happening. Those 2,414 exonerations total 21,095 years lost to incarceration. That's an average of a little bit less than 9 years per exoneree. Jacksonville, Florida, which recently started a conviction integrity unit, over the weekend exonerated their first 2 people exonerated by a conviction integrity unit in Florida. Actually, because of Florida's habeas law, they had to go hire a defense attorney to file the papers, because a prosecutor is not allowed to vacate a conviction that they have gotten in Florida by law. Those 2 men, an uncle and nephew, had served a total of 43 years for crimes that they didn't commit. In addition, a recent study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences used multiple statistical methods to try and figure out how many people on death row are innocent. We now know enough people who had previously been on death row have been exonerated of the crimes against them that they form a statistically significant data set, which is troubling in and of itself. And we can use multiple statistical methods to try to project what percentage of the capital punishment population is actually innocent. And keep in mind that capital punishment cases are the cases that receive the most scrutiny in our system. And each of the statistical methods used came together at numbers between 4 and 5%. So we're pretty confident that 4 to 5%, between 1 in 20 and 1 in 25 people on death row across the country are actually innocent. And that's great, except we don't know which ones they are. So the next time somebody wants to talk to you about capital punishment, remember that fact and ask yourself how comfortable you are with the ultimate punishment in a situation where we know we've got a 4 to 5% error rate on the facts. So that's the part that everybody talks about. We talk about the number of exonerations that there are, and in fact there have been 70 exonerations in Pennsylvania federal and state courts. We think that DNA is going to solve the problem, but in fact only 16 of those cases involve DNA. While more and more cases have DNA present, we often lose the evidence, lose the DNA, or DNA simply hasn't been collected in some of these older cases. But what we don't then talk about is what happens to these exonerees when they come home. And I first got started thinking about this story by an exoneree very near and dear to my heart, a guy named John Thompson, who was a death row inmate in New Orleans, who spent 18 years in prison and was exonerated under very dramatic circumstances. And way back in 1999, I knew the lawyers that were representing John, and it was my first introduction to error in the criminal justice system. I was kind of blown away by it. I just thought it never occurred to me that it happened, right? I just sort of trusted in the system. But then John got exonerated and finally released in 2004, and here's what happened. John was exonerated, and I actually used to oversell this story. I said I used to say that he got released with $10 and a bus pass and the clothes that he'd been arrested in. And it turns out that he'd gotten released from a prison that wasn't where he was actually officially an inmate, so he didn't get the $10. Just the clothes that he'd been arrested in and a bus pass. He didn't get any vocational or work or any sort of training while he was in prison because he was on death row, and why would we spend those resources on somebody that we planned to kill? And he didn't get any sort of rehabilitation or other readjustment training because he wasn't a criminal, so how could prison have affected him negatively? Right? So it was this combination of ironies, of rich ironies, that led to John going back to New Orleans without a job, having to explain the last 18 years of his life, but then explain that actually, no, he wasn't guilty, having no documents that one might use to reestablish an identity or a credit history or any of the things that you might need. Louisiana at the time did not have a compensation statute. It subsequently got one. Pennsylvania, as you will hear, still does not have one, despite the fact that we have 70 people that we've exonerated. We still don't do anything to compensate those people for their lost years. And nobody really focusing on the problem. So today what we're going to do is we're going to spend some time having Eugene tell you his story, which is gripping. And then we've got a terrific panel of people that I'll introduce in more detail when we get to that part of the conversation, who can talk about various initiatives that we have going on to try to rectify that and to try to create an environment for exonerees when they come back to our communities that honestly is like the least we can do, right? Because we're not even doing the least we can do. So how do we make that better for these people who have suffered at the hands of our system and try to make that wrong as right as it can be under the circumstances? So we have Laura Bazelon, who joins us, an associate professor of criminal juvenile justice and racial justice clinical programs at the University of San Francisco Law School. Laura has written a tremendous book called Rectify about restorative justice as a tool to make the, thank you. Copies are available outside afterwards. We have Marissa Boyers-Bluestein, who is here, the executive director of the Pennsylvania Innocence Project and the woman who led the charge to get Eugene exonerated. And we have John Eldan, who's here. John is the director of a program called After Innocence, a nonprofit in Oakland that is creating transparency, equality, and improved reentry opportunities for exonerees, working on a one-on-one basis with over 400 exonerees in 41 states at last count. So what I'd like to do is, I think we have the refreshments in the back. You guys should feel free to continue to refresh as the mood suits. There is, if you go past the check-in table and down the stairs, there are restrooms there. I'd like to ask, I think, Eugene, why don't you come up? You can either be here or here, wherever you feel comfortable. Talk for a little while, and then when you're ready, we'll call the rest of the panelists up, and we'll have that conversation. Does that work? Yeah. Okay, welcome Eugene Gilliard, please. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, great, thank you.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Eugene Gilliard. I'm going to try to bring my story and kind of bring it in different scenarios. So first, I'd like to talk about my life when I was arrested. I'm trying to talk about my pursuit towards getting exonerated and trying to have my freedom restored, and kind of how my life had been post-exoneration. The crime I was convicted for, wrongfully convicted, was a man in my neighborhood. He owned a bar and a seafood store. His name was Thomas Kill. I used to see him somewhat 3 to 4 to 5 times a week. I used to hang in front of a Chinese store down the street from where he predominantly ran his businesses. So on the night where he was actually shot and murdered, I was actually approximately 50 feet away in front of this Chinese store that I previously mentioned. Heard the shots, looked in the direction, seen 2 individuals running towards me, and then kind of cut off on a side street, run through a grass field. So I got up, accompanied by my friends, walked up to the crime scene. By the time I had got there, a crowd had already gathered. I was kind of in the back, trying to peer with the crowd, trying to observe what exactly had happened. At that time, I kind of had an idea, but I didn't know for sure. Shortly thereafter, my mom had rode up on a bicycle. I lived near the crime scene where the crime had occurred. She heard the gunshots, came out, wanted to make sure that I was safe and everything was okay with me. She stood out on the crime scene with me for approximately 3 to 5 minutes, and we had left, and I went home with her that night. A couple days later, I remember I was back in front of this Chinese store hanging out with some childhood friends of mine. Police kind of came out, canvassing the neighborhood, looking for eyewitnesses, and they came down there and they kind of asked us some questions. And I had told them everything I had known at the time, including hearing a shot, seeing the individuals running towards me in the general direction in which they ran. It was 2.5 years later, I remember this day, January 8th, 1998. I was actually asleep in my room early in the morning, and I remember being thrown onto the floor, cops on my back, handcuffed me. So I'm asking at this time, why am I being treated this way? Why are y'all in my room? Why are y'all, wrestling me to the ground? Why are y'all dragging me down my steps? They wouldn't tell me anything. When I got downstairs to the first level of my house, I seen that my family was on the floor. They were made to sit on their floor on their hands in a circle. And they had cops standing there in tactical gear watching my family and several officers kind of bringing me out. I remember coming out my house, and very quickly, everything happened so fast. It was very coordinated. I was brought out to the house, seeing that the cops had the general area surrounded and blocked off, and I was taken to the roundhouse, which is known as the Philadelphia Police Headquarters in downtown Philadelphia, 8th and Race. So I remember when I got there, and at this time when I was being interrogated for this crime, this was the first time that I actually learned that I was being held for the murder of Mr. Thomas Kidd. So I began to tell him everything I knew, including what I had initially told him two plus years prior. So when I was told what I was there for, I actually felt great. Wow, okay, I have nothing to worry about. You would think that I would understand that I was arrested being what I had just endured, but I did not know that. I still thought, okay, they're gonna ask me what they previously asked me. I'm gonna tell them everything I know, and then they're gonna let me go. Unfortunately, that did not happen. I was actually charged and taken to the current from home correctional facility in Philadelphia to await my trial for the murder of Mr. Thomas Kidd. So I was devastated about this. How am I being arrested for something I didn't do? How is this even possible? But nevertheless, I said, okay, they made a mistake, but I have a trial date coming up, and this mistake is going to be rectified then. I never thought in a million years that it was possible that I could be convicted for something I didn't do. I had faith in the justice system. I thought it was a flawed system. I thought that it was no way that what had happened to me could happen. So I remember going to trial. And I remember that there was no evidence against me except one eyewitness, and this was the victim's daughter, who had observed the perpetrator through a second-floor window on the opposite side of the street, 2:30 in the morning, peering through a fan in the screen, looking on the opposite side of the street. She identified one of the perpetrators as light-skinned, one of them was brown-skinned or darker complexion, and that the light-skinned defendant was pulling a bandana up and down on his face, and she only observed his face for a few seconds. So I remember prior to me having this trial, I had a lineup. She had came to the lineup, her and another witness. And I was positioned in the number 2 position in this lineup. And I remember one guy identified number 5. She identified me in the number 2 position, then said, I am not sure. However, by the time she had come to my trial, she has now testified that she was 100% certain that I was the guy she seen murder her father that night. So even in hearing that, it angered me, but I thought, okay, there's no way that I can be convicted for something I didn't do. And I remember the jury deliberating at the conclusion of my trial, which was very fast, approximately 3 to 5 days this trial occurred. And the jury was deliberating for approximately half of that time, for about 2 days. And I remember I would come down to this holding cell, I would be in the basement, I would come up only to hear that the jury had a question or that they had a note and they was informing the judge that they was deadlocked, meaning that they could not unanimously agree upon a verdict. So I was saying to myself, how is this possible? There's only one true verdict. What are y'all struggling with? I didn't do it. So I remember saying, okay, they just struggling, they still reviewing the facts. This is gonna come to an end shortly. And I'm gonna have lost at this time approximately 11 months of my life. So I remember coming back to the courtroom, my court-appointed attorney said the jury had reached a verdict. So I was happy, I was relieved. Okay, here it is, I'm about to get found not guilty, and I'm gonna get to go home, and I'm gonna get to put my life back on order, go back to school, etc. So I remember standing for the jury for the verdict, and the verdict being read, guilty of second-degree murder. So when I heard this, I immediately was stunned. I couldn't believe what I just heard. And everything happened so fast after that, because in Pennsylvania, when you get found guilty of second-degree murder, it's a mandatory life without the possibility of parole. The judge have no discretion in sentencing whatsoever. So I was immediately sentenced and ushered out the courtroom. People also asked me, what did you say? What did you feel? The best way of describing this, I was completely numb. I didn't feel anything. I was actually not able to speak until I was just being ushered out the courtroom. I asked my attorney, would he file a appeal on my behalf, and he said that he would. So I remember going back to the prison which I was held, being taken to the RHU, being segregated in a cell away from the general population, as I was now deemed to be a threat against the general population because of my sentence of life without the possibility of parole. So I remember going up to Camp Hill Correctional Facility, going to Greater Fort, and being assigned to the prison where I was assigned to serve the natural rest of my remaining life, SCI Mahanoy in Frackville, Pennsylvania. So when I got to this prison, at this time, my lawyer had just filed a brief. And I remember he raised 2 claims in this brief. And I had faith in these 2 claims. One of the claims was that the judge erred in denying me a jury view, meaning that the judge permitted the jury to go out to the crime scene and view the eyewitness, her vantage. Be able to go up there and see the same identification point that she had, the same view that she had that night in which the crime occurred. The judge denied that motion that my lawyer filed. So we felt like I was deprived of fair trial as a result of that. And there was another claim in which the judge denied that my judge instruct the jury to receive the eyewitness identification testimony with caution because of her failure to identify me on a prior occasion. And the judge denied that instruction in the jury instructions. So I felt, okay, I was found guilty for a crime I didn't commit. I'm on appeal, and I'm still having faith in our system, saying, okay, this is the purpose of the appellate procedure, to rectify the mistakes that had happened before. And I was denied. And I remember I had one more shot. In Pennsylvania, entitled to attorney on your first Post-Eviction Relief Act petition. And I had an attorney, and he wrote to me and said, I'm your attorney, I will be viewing your file and filing your PCRA petition on your behalf. Never heard from him again after that. The next time I would hear from him was through the courts. They sent me a copy of his letter when they dismissed my PCRA petition based off my attorney's letter saying he had reviewed my file and had come to the conclusion that he could not find a single claim in my file that he can represent me on. So for that reason, he asked the judge to allow for him to withdraw as my attorney, and the judge permitted him to do so. So essentially now I was out of an attorney. I had no right to an attorney, no funds to appoint an attorney. So I felt like, what am I to do now? Am I to just wallow and just sit back and give up on myself, go see the psych, maybe get on some psych meds and try to escape the reality of what I'm doing? And do I just fight and try to do the best that I can do? Well, fortunately, because I'm from the bloodline of my mother and my grandma, I decided to fight. So I went to the law library. I began to sit with those who knew more than I. I began to write to every Innocence Project at this time whom I had heard of, even knew of, who I ever seen written or posted an article in any type of publication whatsoever, listened to any help that I could whatsoever. And I remember, for the most part, most of the Innocence Project at that time was not able to assist me because either one, they only accepted DNA cases, and my case was a non-DNA case, or two, that they were so far away from me that they could not properly represent me due to the geographical location in which my crime had occurred. But I remember that there was one journalist school in Pittsburgh, and they took on my case, interest in my case. I was communicating with some law students, and they had wrote an article in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, a local newspaper in Pittsburgh. And I felt good about that. I was getting some publicity. But the best thing that came from this organization was that the director of that organization informed me about the Pennsylvania Innocence Project and that they were beginning to open their doors and that I should write to Marissa Bluestein in her office and seek their help. And I remember he gave me their address. So I wrote to Marissa, and I remember getting back a questionnaire. And this was about approximately 3 to 4 pages of general questions about my case. And I was to fill out and answer these questions to the best of my ability. And I remember having a pencil and sharpening this pencil so fine that the point was so sharp that just so I can write as much as I can between the 3 to 4 inches that was in between each paragraph. I wanted to tell my story on these few pages. So this is what I did. And I remember not hearing anything for a while, and then I began to communicate with some law students from the Pennsylvania Innocence Project. In the meantime, I had gotten a letter from my mother. My co-defendant, who was also wrongfully convicted, who's also free today, he was in SCI Albion. We were friends before the crime happened, we were friends today. And we used to fight and do the best we can do together in proving our innocence. And we used to write to one another. Because Pennsylvania prisoners are not allowed to write to one another direct, we used to have to write third party, meaning he would send it to my mom, and my mom would remove it from the Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution envelope and put it in a regular envelope and send it to me as though it was from her. Sometimes I would get them, sometimes it would not pass the screening stage and I would not get them. So I remember this one letter kept being returned. My mom informed me about that, and I called her. So I said, just read it to me. What is he saying? Just thinking it's a general check-in letter. And he said that he had heard that a guy named Rolex, one of the true perpetrators of my crime, who we had known at the time by his general nickname of Rolex, may be willing to help. So when I heard this, I knew that this is something I had to act on. Pennsylvania have a 60-day rule in Pennsylvania where you gotta be diligent when you learn of this evidence. You got 60 days to bring that claim the first chance that you can bring it. So I remember writing to Marissa, the Blue Pennsylvania Innocence Project, informing them about this letter, and they informed me that they still reviewing my case, but I had to act on this on my own behalf. And I had a great friend at this time who had one home. His name was Earl Allen. He believed in my innocence. I never asked him for nothing, but here was a time when he asked me, dude, is there anything you need? I said, this is a time I need to seek his assistance. So I said, this was the time when I finally said to him yes, when he asked me, do you need anything? And I explained to him generally what I had learned through this letter from my co-defendant, and I needed him to hire a private investigator to go speak to this guy Rolex to see in which manner was he willing to help. And he hired this investigator for me. And this investigator went and spoke to this guy Rolex, and Rolex gave a general confession. Eugene and Lance didn't do it. Me and my friend Tiz did it. And that was general. So I filed a petition raising this claim. At this time, the Pennsylvania Innocence Project my case had advanced a little bit more, and they had took my case to the Case Review Board Committee. And the board was to review my case, and based on this information, would determine if they would take my case on for representation. And I remember getting a letter from Charlotte Whitmore, who was the first staff attorney at the Pennsylvania Innocence Project. And she told me that the board had unanimously agreed to take my case on for investigation. And based on this investigation, would determine if they would take me on for representation. And I was happy. Finally, someone believing in my innocence, someone who's willing to listen to me, to go out and investigate my case. So I remember them from the moment they took my case on, things began to happen. This guy, Rolex, gave a detailed confession. They began to come up and tell me about things about my case that I had not even known. That this guy shot someone earlier the same day with the same gun that he used in my crime. That was the reason why he came to my neighborhood to escape the cops that was looking for him in his neighborhood. And then he came to my neighborhood and shot and killed the guy in my neighborhood. Then he kept that gun and shot someone else in the face with the same shotgun 3 months later. They found this guy he shot, and this guy admitted that, yes, I was shot by Rolex, and they got his medical records. It's so much corroboratory evidence. So now I got a petition this deep. And I remember this petition being approximately 58 pages, and approximately 50 of these pages was exhibits, new discovered evidence. And I remember the Pennsylvania Innocence Project writing to the district attorney's office, asking the district attorney's office not to believe our assessment of what had happened to Eugene, but do your own independent investigation based off this evidence that we uncovered. However, the the district attorney's office in Philadelphia never even filed a response. They never even acknowledged that letter. The first time we actually heard of them was when we finally went to court. And their only opposition against me was not that I wasn't innocent, was that I was not timely. I did not file this at the earliest point in which I could have filed it. And because they believed that I didn't do so, the judge didn't have jurisdiction to even review this, and she should just dismiss it and send me back to prison. But the judge said, no, this is not what we're going to do. I'm going to have a hearing. I'm going to bring Eugene Gilliard down to Philadelphia County to have a hearing. I will examine everything. Was he timely? And if I deemed that he was timely, then we would look at the merits of this petition. I remember being taken to Philadelphia. At this time, I was in this prison for 14 years. I had never left this prison. I forgot what the other side of this wall looked like. So I remember when I was moved from this prison to SCI Greater Ward to be close to the Philadelphia courthouse. I remember being in his car, and I tell this story so that y'all have a sense of what I went through. And the sheriffs was driving me down to Philadelphia, and they were speeding through these small blocks. And remember, I haven't been in a car in 14 years, so I was petrified. I'm seeing traffic coming towards me on both sides of the car. I'm thinking I'm not going to make it down here. I wanted to knock on the glass and tell the sheriff, I feel great about my chances. Please slow down. But fortunately, I did make it down there. And I remember having this court hearing, and it's pretty much lasts longer than we anticipated it would last. It kind of lasted over the summer of 2013. 2, 3 days in this week, a day this week, based off the judge's open schedule. And I remember everything that was in this petition now came out as actual evidence. People began to testify. The district attorney office had an opportunity to cross-examine this evidence, the judge to make a credibility assessment. And I remember at the conclusion of this hearing feeling great, not knowing what my opportunities were, what was going to happen, but feeling like I had already won. Why? Because the truth had come out, and ultimately that's what I wanted. Whether the truth was going to set me free or not, I didn't care. I was just happy that the truth had come out. So for whatever reason, if it didn't set me free, I could feel great that the truth had come out, and that was all I evidently was seeking at this time. So I remember my attorney telling me, okay, we're going to have closing arguments today. We don't know what's going to happen. The judge have no timeline for her ruling. She can rule today, meaning that day. She can rule sometime later, and she have no timeline for when she can rule. But when she do, we will notify you. Now, I remember at conclusion of closing arguments, the judge said the court is ready to rule. So when I heard this, I said, wow, I'm going to learn my faith on this day. So I remember the courtroom being packed with representatives from the Pennsylvania Innocence Project, my attorney, law students who had participated in the case. And I remember the judge began to speak, and I was listening very attentively to her words. And it said, okay, that is great what she said. That is favorable. Okay, that's favorable. So I kind of knew after the first 3 minutes that her speaking that this was great. This would possibly go my way. And it did. And I remember the judge overturning me and my co-defendant's conviction, slamming the gavel down and kind of just beat line, just getting up, jumping off the bench, and the whole courtroom erupted in applaud, and my family was crying. And this was not cried, of course. So I remember feeling, wow, this is great. So I was taken back to the prison in which I was held. Now, instead of being there as the loser, having to file an appeal, I was actually there, feeling great. Now, if there was an appeal to be filed, the district attorney was the ones who had to file it. And that's a great position to be in. But I was almost certain that they would, and that this would drag on for several more years before the final outcome would actually happen, and I would learn of it. However, the district attorney didn't file an appeal. And I remember on the 30th day saying, this is the day they're going to file it. From my experience, they almost always file the appeal on the last day in which they have to file it. But I remember that 30th day coming, my attorney calling the prison, and I being ushered down to my counselor's office because I had a legal conversation to be had on the phone. So I said, okay, I'm going to get on this phone. They're going to tell me what I believe is that the district attorney filed the appeal. And I got on the phone, and not only did my attorney say the district attorney has elected not to file an appeal, which now makes the judge's ruling final and granting you a new trial, but they also have agreed to let you come home on house arrest. So I said, wow, I'm coming home, so this is great. And I remember within a week later, I was stepping out of the sheriff's van into my mother's arms at her house. And I remember news being there, family and representatives and Marissa and everyone from the Pennsylvania Innocence Project being there, walking into my mother's house and having options. Even though I was on house arrest, this is the most freedom I had known at that time. So very quickly, things began to happen. I remember while I was on house arrest, Marissa and I was going back to court asking the judge to remove me off house arrest. And I remember saying, I don't know if that's a good idea. The last thing I want the judge to think is that I'm not grateful. But she went back and they attempted to make the argument for why I shouldn't be on house arrest, and the judge said, I don't need to hear it. I said, this is either a good thing or a bad thing. There's nothing you can say to make me take him off house arrest, or I have already made my mind up. Fortunately, it was the latter. She had already made her mind up, but she allowed me to be released on taken off house arrest. So I was free now as any other citizen, free to travel and go anywhere they want. But I still was not free because I still had these charges pending. And I didn't feel like I was free. I wasn't free. So fortunate for me, after several times of going back to court and the judge put more pressure on the district attorney office to come up with a decision, they elected in June of 2014 to drop all charges. So I was finally free. And I'm happy to be here. So now I'm talking about my life post-exoneration. When I came home, the world was a total different place. I remember my wife giving me an iPad, and I said, what is this? One of the first things I did was kind of Google my name, and I seen all these articles. I said, wow, I just put my name in this thing, and all these articles come up, huh? And I remember reading all these articles that I hadn't read and seeing how the world had, and being interested by this, and being amazed by this. And I remember guys was there to assist me, John Eldon. I remember having a conversation with John, and he helping me with regards to how to get health insurance and things that I had not known at the time. When I went to prison, I was 16 years old. I really didn't, to be frank with you, I didn't know anything about health insurance. I didn't know nothing about anything. But I was fortunate enough to have people to help me. I was fortunate enough to have family that would open their doors to me and to give me a chance and allow for me to grow. And I was happy at that opportunity, and I'm still happy, and I'm grateful. And I continue to push forward with my life. I got employment, got several promotions since then. Me and my wife had bought a home. I had 2 children that we had together, and things are great. My life is great. I actually have not a single complaint. And I'm just happy to be here and to have the opportunity to have this platform to speak on the reality of wrongful convictions and how it's a reality. I'm sure that most of you are like how I was, think that this is something that do not occur, oblivious of the fact. Here I was, a direct recipient of this, never thinking that it would happen to me. Even after it happened to me, never think that that this system would continuously fail me, and it did. But I'm grateful that it was rectified 16 years later, and I'm here talking to each and every one of you, bringing light to this wrongful and this reality of wrongful convictions. Thank you for your time and attention. Thank you.
So thank you, Gene. That's, there's nothing like hearing the story from the person who experienced it. And I'm always blown away, and it's a gift to be able to hear that story, and thank you for sharing it with everybody here. 2 things that I wanted to ask you about from your talk. The first one was, you said you were 16?
Yes.
When you went in, so you were a juvenile.
I was.
Charged as an adult.
Correct.
Which makes it all the less likely that when you got out, you would know how to do the things that you would need to do to be an adult.
Yes.
In our society. I like to quote other people who are smarter than me, and that makes it easy because I can find just about anybody. But Brian Stevenson is clearly in that category. And Brian has this TED Talk in which he says that he was representing a juvenile who's being charged as an adult and in a southern courthouse, and he went to sleep not really knowing how he was going to argue this particular motion, but he woke up the next day and he was sort of taken over by a spirit that moved him, and he said, "Your Honor, if you're going to try my client as if he's somebody that he's not, could you please try him as if he's the white 55-year-old CEO of a Fortune 500 company?" And it just strikes me that by trying you as an adult and giving you that large penalty, we make it that much harder for you to come back and acclimatize into society because we're not treating you as the person that you are at the time. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about is, despite the fact that you went in at that age, you knew that there was a 60-day rule that you had to reach out to Rolex in order to keep up with the post-conviction timeliness things. How did you know that?
So for my time of sitting in the law library reading the books, this is one of the first things that is highlighted in that book. People who have read this book before me actually probably physically highlighted it. I also seen many people get the doors slammed in their face as a result of this rule, so I didn't want to be a victim of that rule.
That's amazing. I think just the diligence and the sophistication and the intelligence and the awareness to figure that out for yourself and to take control of things that way under those circumstances is nothing short of amazing. And
Thank you,
it's just an incredible thing. We're going to have time for Q&A, but I'd like to invite our panelists to come up if they would, and kind of have that conversation. So with Professor Bluestein, Professor Bazelon, and Mr. Elden, we have 3 different approaches to support for people who find themselves in Gene's position when they come home. And because they're a little bit different, I'd like to have each of them talk briefly about their approaches, and then I may or may not use moderator's privilege to ask a question, but we'd like to turn it over to you guys and have you ask whatever questions come to mind, and kind of take time to do that. I think what we might do is to start with John, since he's kind of talking about the structural aspects of coming back, and then go to, I think, Laura and then Marissa to talk about some of the more emotional aspects of having been in prison for that period of time and coming back. So, John, why don't you take it away and tell us what you do?
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you for having me, John and the Quattrone Center, and Denise and Frank Quattrone, who've supported my work, and thank you all for being here. You always say thank you. I really mean it, because my work involves this part, the after part, the part that is, as John mentioned earlier, so often forgotten, or if remembered, is remembered or the focus for just a very brief period of time. And it makes it difficult to sometimes get the attention it deserves for this work and for these people. And one of the reasons you just kind of heard, the stories of any wrongfully convicted person are gripping, frightening, horrifying, also inspiring, but the arc of them usually finishes somewhere around the courthouse steps, right? And the stories of what happens afterward, not only in the ensuing hours and weeks and months, but really in years, is something that's very hard to stay focused on. And I'm glad that we're doing that today. I am an attorney. I am from California, and from there I run a tiny nonprofit that is trying to address the after effects of wrongful conviction in a rather broad way. As John mentioned, the National Registry of Exonerations lists 2,400 some odd exonerees since 1989. We have a count even before 1989. For many reasons, that's an undercount on both ends of that spectrum. There are things about this population that are not as inspiring or hopeful as some of the stories that we've all heard. Many people who cannot come and speak about their experiences, many people we cannot find. It is a population, 85% of which has been out for longer than 2 years. Half of them have been out for longer than 10 years. And if we were to survey them, and I'm in the process of doing a rather robust survey of the ones that I'm in touch with, we will find that the vast majority of them never got any reliable or consistent reentry support from the beginning, middle, and to the current day. We have, in many respects, a crisis of people out there trying to rebuild their lives, and many of them not faring nearly as well as the folks that we often hear from. And so one of the things that points I'm going to make is a not super exciting, hopeful, or inspiring one until I tell you what we're doing about it. But it's to really get us focused on the fact that while we appropriately pay a lot of attention to the exoneree who just got out, there are many who are out and out and out and out for many, many years. So the question that I've tried to address in my work, which I've been at for 15 years informally and 4 years full-time as a bona fide nonprofit, is what can we do for a huge number of them that is beneficial, consistent, serious, reliable, and that we can roll out quickly? Because if we do it slowly, most of them will not see any help before they are done. And we are way late in getting to them. It's one of these crazy issues where if you go around America and you talk to people all over the political spectrum, wherever they are, as soon as they are convinced that you're talking about a person who spent time in prison for something they did not do, they are overwhelmingly in support of being generous in ways that we are not generous, curious in ways that we are not curious, helpful in ways we are not helpful. The problems are huge in terms of how we can get to them. So my project is, I'm a guy with a cell phone in my house, and I call up exonerees one by one. And I started doing this, and I'm glad to be here in Philadelphia and look out and see my very first exoneree client is here in this room, who I heard about in 2004, who expressed a need for legal services, and I did something crazy. I picked up the phone and I cold called a couple of attorneys in Philadelphia, a city I'd never been to, maybe I just passed through, and I said, I've got this exoneree friend of mine. Didn't tell him I was only 2 years out of law school, but he was a senior lawyer in a big firm, and I said, would you let me tell you, give me 90 seconds to tell you about a pro bono case I think you should take? And he laughed, and he said, okay. And I told him about this guy. I said he's an Innocence Project client. At the time, it was Innocence Project in New York that was doing a lot of work all around the country before Marissa and others in the states stepped up and started doing great things on a state-by-state basis. And I said, he's a DNA exoneree, he's an Innocence Project client, he's the first DNA exoneree in Pennsylvania, and can you help with something? And he laughed and said, okay, you've got 80 seconds or something clever like that. And I told him a little more, and he said, send me the materials, and I did, and the next day he said, I'll take the case. And this was a light bulb moment for me because it told me that I could do something that was far better than using my new skills as a lawyer to work for someone. I could connect people, find out about their problems, and that we should be doing this. I saw a map of the United States, and at the time it was probably dozens of little lights, and now it's thousands. And the question is, how quickly can we do this? How can we get out there and find them, find out what problems are, and bring some kind of help? And as Jean mentioned, my work pivoted in 2014 because as I started to get into this and try and do it after I left the law firm and full-time, I thought, well, why don't I just call up more people and do this? I met a population that didn't need legal services by and large. They were telling me, no, that's great. I'll call you if I ever need something, but I've been out 18 years. I don't need a lawyer. Anything I can think of. But I do need health care. What do you know about Obamacare? And for several months, my answer was nothing. And then I took several months off in the summer of 2014 and took a deep dive and became someone who could counsel people about health care eligibility across the spectrum, Medicaid, Medicare as well. And so the offering of my organization is, tell me, I'll call you up. This is all free, by the way, everything free. You will have one-on-one help from me or from a volunteer that I oversee. We're not going to refer you out. We're going to take you through the process of finding out what you're eligible for, getting it, and very importantly, using it. If you have a problem seeing a doctor, you call us. We'll help you. If you need a lawyer, we'll help you. That is done in the same way it has been done for years by getting people to step up and take cases and then monitoring them to conclusion. And slowly other things. So that is the work. That offer has been made actually now to 583 exonerees across 48 states and more coming. I am now really going out and finding exonerees and calling them up, people on the registry who haven't heard from anybody for years and saying, can we help you? And they don't quite know what to make of it until we do help them, and then they're usually calling back for stuff, and it's been great and it's growing. And the goal is to build a platform through which we can continue to broaden and also to increase the amount of work. And doing this work, I've learned a ton about these folks, and I'm also just at the beginning of understanding in the way that, the best way that somebody who's never been through it can, I hope, by listening to the struggles and the realities, which are daunting and depressing, as they are also inspiring and stories of resilience. I often tell people, if you believe in wrongful conviction, you have some very bummer corollaries. Here are the bummer corollaries. If you believe in wrongful conviction, then you must believe that as we sit here today, in every prison in America, there are innocent people. And here's a bigger bummer. We're not going to get them all out, because to presume that we could is to make the fundamental error that has us here to begin with. It's to be fundamentally unbelieving in error, unbelieving in the fact that we should try and minimize error as much as we can, but that we're never going to do it completely, and we have to keep our eyes open and curious about how it happens, where it's happened, and for these purposes, what we're going to do once we find them. Because the measure of any society is in part its fairness. An individual's fairness, a corporation's fairness, a university's fairness is how it responds to its mistakes. Does it pretend like they never happen? Does it treat them like one-offs? Or does it look for them? Does it try and prevent them? And then, does it take the opportunity to step up and make amends? And Pennsylvania does not have amends right now. We'd love to see that changed. And in a way that is meaningful, a way that honestly reckons with what has happened, which will never be undone, but can be met with seriousness rather than callousness, and with creativity in terms of what we can do to do better than other states. And I'm a real optimist about this, and I believe in you and your fellow Pennsylvanians to ask your legislature to do what's fair, to do what's right, to treat someone who has been held in prison for something that they didn't do in a way no different than any other victim of state harm. If I walk across the street and get hit by a state trooper, I'm allowed to go into court and prove my damages. If I'm wrongfully convicted by the state of Pennsylvania and I satisfy them that I was not that person who did the crime, I am not. In most states that you get compared to that have compensation statutes, you are not allowed to go in and to make that statement. This is what happened to me. That's a meaningful thing. And I hope that that's at least considered, even if it's a reach politically in every state these days. I'll stop now. I've got a lot of curiosity about what my colleagues are going to say and want to hear from Jean as well. But thank you all for being here, and thank you for not forgetting about the after effects, the consequences of things that are part of every system.
Thanks, John. I'm glad that you're spending your time doing what you're doing instead of updating your website so that I can be so far off on my stats with how many people you were serving and in how many states. How many states do have compensation statutes?
So it's 34, I believe. 37. Notice it tells you 37. That includes the federal government in D.C. So that would be 35. That's right, 34 plus Kansas, 35 states plus the feds in D.C.
And are there states that do, in addition to, so compensation takes however long it takes to run through the process. There are caps. There are other boards that have to reassess your case, right? There's still barriers. It's not like you just walk out of prison and get a check.
Absolutely. One of the real unfairness, in fact, to Pennsylvania, to Oregon, to New Mexico, places don't have compensation statutes, is you get thrown into the bad pile and the other states get to be in the good pile, but that's not right. If you look at those other states, you will find out, you don't need to be a lawyer, just read the statutes. Severe limitations on access, who gets it. In some places, you need a pardon from the governor. In other places, they only compensate you for DNA cases, but not for non-DNA cases. In process, in some states it takes years. In some states, it's up to the legislature to fund it. They may not. And then in terms of what you get, in some states, the amount of money offered is by any measure insulting.
Is there a state that does stuff in addition to that the way you do, that provides any other services, or is compensation statutes kind of what we got?
There's a subset of those states that purport to provide, as we say in the law. They have it on the books that you're supposed to get things other than money for time. That could take the form of money for reentry services, for education. I'm in the midst of a survey right now of the exonerees who've been compensated in those states. And early results are in, and these offerings are largely illusory. For reasons that are both predictable and just unfortunate. Predictable because they're written in ways that are clearly illusory, and unfortunate in that we don't really have a lot of experience about how to do this work well with a tiny dispersed population. And it's challenging. It's not necessarily bad intentions. It's very difficult to get it right, to get the stuff delivered. So it's a real impediment to helping these folks. But a statute's really important because it's a confession. It's a recognition that this happens. And even if you have no exonerations on your books, you should have a statute, just like you have a law that says that if the state truck hits you, you get to be made whole. So.
Thank you. And I think I would add one more thing to our responsibilities that you listed when somebody is wrongfully convicted and we find out about it. And hopefully that's where the Quattrone Center comes in, which is we have a responsibility to learn about the case. We have a responsibility to understand the various things that contributed to its happening, and we have a responsibility to talk to all the participants in that case and get them to reform and improve their practices. And in any other industry that has ever done this, quality improvement is a cyclical thing. It's a thing that we do a little bit at a time, step by step. And learning from these cases, and I would argue not just wrongful convictions, but any time an officer discharges his weapon, any time we have a death in custody, any time we have a case where we know the system isn't working the way it's designed to work, we should learn about those cases and not be afraid of that. It's the least we can do for somebody like Jean. Marissa, you want to talk about the work that or Laura? You guys going to go that way?
You had announced Laura first.
Yes.
Although I am
You
happy
can't
to
count on
step
me.
in.
I don't know what I'm talking
Dealer's
about.
choice, so.
Go ahead, Laura.
Well, first of all, I want to say to everyone here, thank you so much for coming, and to John Holloway, who I have known and admired from afar. It's wonderful to meet you. And Eugene, thank you for your story, and it is awesome for me to be reunited with my colleagues in the trenches, John and Marissa. So thank you to everyone. I don't want to speak for too long. I just want to talk a little bit about what I've been focused on recently. I, like Marissa, she still is, I was an advocate on behalf of people who are wrongfully convicted, and so I advocated and retried some of those cases and had experience from that perspective of being an advocate and being very invested in a binary outcome. And then as I moved on and started thinking about things in a different way, And as I was thinking when Eugene was telling his story, what occurred to me was, well, what does it mean to really be free? Because, as John was saying, you have this moment at the courthouse steps, and then, as Eugene was talking about, you go through all these stages of your case, and then ultimately the judge makes this pronouncement. And we have this idea, I think, as a society that that moment is kind of this line in the sand that separates you from your incarcerated self and your free self. And that free self emerges kind of like a phoenix from the ashes. And that's not how it works. And so because I had represented people who had been wrongfully convicted, and I was very invested in their survival and not wanting them to fall away, because once the glare of the media spotlight is away from you, and once the news cameras go away, and once you're not being invited to talk on various shows or being interviewed, you're left with the damage that is the wreckage of the life that was stolen from you. And what do you do at that point? And as someone who, again, was just sort of invested in the system from an advocate perspective, I was really curious to know, what can we do to repair some of the damage and some of these harmed relationships? And what I found, just kind of from talking to a lot of people, including as my starting point, the wonderful Marissa, who we'll hear from next, is that there is this process going on in this country, and it's a nascent movement, but it's growing, and it's about bringing principles of restorative justice to bear on wrongful convictions. And so maybe perhaps like some of you in this room, I'd not heard of restorative justice before 2015. I didn't know what it was. And it's really this idea that we're going to recreate or reimagine our system. And we're not going to go through this punitive system, which has failed so dramatically to punish people who actually committed crimes, and we've victimized the people who we branded as perpetrators. Instead, we're going to ask who was harmed, what are their needs, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs. And what is interesting about this process is that often what it involves is bringing together people who were wrongfully convicted with the people on the other side, either because they mistakenly but in good faith identified the wrong person, or simply because they were the family member of someone who had been harmed or murdered, and they were told a lie, which was that this person was guilty, and they believed it and went to bed every night wanting this person to die. Or they were the juror that convicted even though they had doubt because they were pressured by other jurors. Whatever their role in the system, they felt this tremendous sense of guilt. And what is interesting when you bring these people together is the shared trauma of this experience, which I analogize to an earthquake of exoneration, because it just is so profoundly disruptive. But when you come at it from all these different sides, what you see is that those people who were directly involved and directly impacted are in a strange way, even though they faced off on opposite sides of the courtroom, the only people in the world who can truly understand the other one and provide the other side of the story. So I'll just briefly talk about kind of a concrete example. I'm a concrete person. And one of the stories that I followed involved a gentleman named Thomas Webb. He was wrongfully convicted of raping someone, and it was a cross-racial identification, which, as many people know, it's very, very difficult to identify outside of race. There's something called own race bias. It's very, very hard to be accurate, especially if you're being terrorized and violently assaulted. And so the victim in this case, Sarah, she mistakenly identified him, and he was sent away. And he spent a long time in prison, and then he was released because of DNA. And I think he was the first DNA exoneree in Oklahoma. And when he got out, I think he initially felt a lot of elation because he got some media attention, and he had met his wife while he was in prison, and it seemed sort of on the surface that he was doing well. But his underlying harm had not been addressed, and in particular that his family truly believed that he was guilty, and they had abandoned him and did not reconnect with him afterwards, that the state of Oklahoma refused to compensate him, even though he was the poster child for the law. They denied him on some kind of procedural ground, and he just spiraled downward into despair and addiction. And lo and behold, all these years later, through a variety of events, he became sober, and he got a part-time job, and he was asked to speak at a high school about his experience. And it was the high school that the victim had gone to. And she saw the advertisement for it on her Facebook page, and she decided to go. And this is someone whose life had really been broken by what had happened to her, and had never really recovered in any meaningful way. And she had read a book, perhaps some of you have heard of it, called Picking Cotton, about an exoneree and a crime victim meeting each other afterwards. And she brought the book. And she came to the lecture, and Oklahoma has really weird weather. It was an ice storm, and it was very hard to get there, and she was very nervous, but she got there early, and she found him in the hallway, and she went up to him, and she expected that he would recognize her, but he didn't, because, of course, he didn't really know her. And she said who she was, and they had this moment in the hallway that was, the beginning of a relationship where she was too overwhelmed to really talk, but she gave him the book, and she said, this is really my story, and I hope you can forgive me. And through a couple of years later, and an organization called Healing Justice that does the work that I'm talking about, they reconnected at a retreat in North Carolina, and both of them went. And she says, and this is what I talk about in the book a little bit, is that while they were going through these exercises, these circle exercises where people are really excavating their feelings and talking about the pain that they felt, and it's exonerees and it's crime victims talking about how they were lied to and believed a false story, and it's their family members talking about how they dealt with years of a loved one being away on both, or losing someone to a victim of crime, and all of these stories coming out. Sarah was really unable to absorb what was happening. It was physically overwhelming for her. She felt ill. She couldn't participate. And she felt that it had been a mistake for her to come there. And then that night they had this event that was sort of like a barbecue and just sort of gathering around a fire, and it was supposed to be very joyous, and she felt really laden down by a lot of grief. And she went up to Thomas and she said, I feel worse than ever, and I'm sorry I came here, and I'm just overcome by what I've done to you, listening to you talk about the damage to your life, and I'll never be able to apologize enough, and I know you'll never forgive me. And he said, I forgave you a long time ago, and you have to forgive yourself if we are both going to move forward from this. And I need you to let go of the feelings that you have, and the shame, and the rage, and the frustration, and just your abject sense that you're an unworthy person. And I need you to forgive yourself so that we can both truly be free and escape the psychological prison that we are in together. And I think that truly it was a breakthrough moment for her, where she understood that part of helping him heal and move forward involved really forgiving herself, and that the process of healing and knitting back our communities is a joint enterprise that we should all be truly wholeheartedly invested in. And for me, I will just say personally that the process of researching this book and meeting people like Thomas and Sarah and listening to their stories, talking to people like Marissa who are every day in the trenches, it occurred to me that it doesn't really matter if the criminal justice system has not touched your life. I think we can all ask ourselves, what is the broken relationship in my life that I would like to fix? And is it not possible that the story that I've told myself, where I am the victim, this other person is the perpetrator, is not in fact the entire story, and that in the most fundamental and intimate relationships in our lives that are most matter, we are always the victim and the perpetrator in some way. And if we can get to this point of understanding, I think it's a way to think about our fundamental beliefs and the way we live our lives differently. And so for me, as profound as it's been to meet all these people, it has been more important still for me to understand that these are life lessons for all of us, and most importantly for myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. That's really moving. And in fact, you have all four of you, I think, met a lot of exonerees, and I suspect you'll agree with me when I say one of the things that always surprises and impresses me when I meet somebody like Eugene or like John Thompson or so many of the other exonerees is how serene they are, and how centered they are. And I feel like I would be so angry. I feel like I would be so outraged, and you guys all seem so graceful and serene with what's happened to you, and it must just be an incredibly hard-won skill, and I really don't know how you do it. But I think if that process, Laura, I think it's a beautiful investment of people in each other, and it is something that is happening more broadly in the criminal justice system. I would encourage you guys, if you ever have a chance, to go visit the Red Hook Community Court out in Brooklyn, where they actually have brought in Native American healers who do circles of restorative justice in a housing project. The Red Hook Community Center is a large housing project, and it has a lot of tenant-to-tenant, sort of low-level addiction and low-level, some very low-level violent crimes. And for those sorts of things, they have a community court that is specially designed to deliver this kind of procedural justice, where people are willing to accept an outcome that might be contrary to their physical interests, so long as the process is fair and respectful. And that sort of procedural justice, that sort of restorative, part of what they'll do is they'll say, instead of going to jail or instead of whatever else, what we want you to do is we want you to sit down with your victim, and we want the victim to sit down with you and other people in a circle that's supportive. They always have food, so the barbecue story rings true, right? And this is a very deliberate thing. And they use that as an opportunity for people to learn about each other and build a bond that will transcend the bond that was broken by the act of the offense. So thank you for bringing that to our attention and for connecting it to the larger sense of what we're doing. Marissa?
So like John, I'm a lawyer. I feel I can come clean with that in this room. And as Jean said, I have been working with the Pennsylvania Innocence Project now since about 2009. And it occurred to us pretty early on, and quite frankly with Jean and Lance coming out of prison, how bad we are of lawyers of really fully appreciating the needs of our clients. As lawyers, we're so used to going into court and just fighting, and fighting for our clients and fighting hard and winning. And we don't really think about what happens after. Because for us, it's, I go home, I can be with my family, and we don't really think about the impact all of this has had on the people that we love, on our clients, and our friends. So we really started looking at this from the project in terms of what can we be doing better? How can we help with this? Because it is so inhumane that in Pennsylvania, as John was saying, when there is an exoneration, we are the ones who go get our clients. My client, Christa Weimer, when she was released very suddenly, was not expected. She was actually released from local custody. She didn't even have a time to go back to her home, her base prison, which is quite far away. So she was released on a rainy day in her orange jumpsuit with her belongings in a trash bag on the side of a road. And we had to go pick her up. And we got a hotel room for her, and my colleagues at the project quite literally ran to Target and were just grabbing things off the shelf that they thought that she would need, and we found a place for her to live and were able to provide for her. But it was just so humiliating for her to have been put in that position, and I thought so inhumane of our system to put her there. And so that really kind of had us thinking about how do we approach this differently? How can we do something to really help our clients as they're emerging into this whole new world? So we do a lot at the project. We have, quite frankly, a separate fund, which you all can contribute to at innocenceprojectpa.org, where we have funds available to be able to provide our clients with some services when they come out. So we provide for cell phones and for transportation and for basic housing, and we can get bedding and clothing for the family member who's going to be housing the individual. So we can provide for some of those desperate needs right off the bat. And then the next thing is we call John. And then John gets in touch with our clients and can help get them on the path that they need to be. And how pathetic it is that I, as a lawyer here in Pennsylvania, need to call a California lawyer to get my clients on systems that I should very well know about. But John knows, so I don't have to. But John is extraordinary of reaching out and dealing with people one-on-one and getting those issues addressed. So we have John. And so we have some level of stability. But then beyond that, it just really started to occur to us that we were not doing enough even yet. So every year there's an Innocence Network. I like to say there's no mothership. We are the Pennsylvania Innocence Project. We are an independent nonprofit organization. We do not report to Barry Scheck. He has nothing to do with our organization. We certainly don't get money from him. But so we're all independent actors. And every year there's a conference where exonerees come and people like us go. And it just struck me as seeing, and especially Jean, when you and Lance went, to see this brotherhood and siblinghood of exonerees meeting together and how powerful that is. That we needed to do something like that here for our clients. Because we had many clients who would go to reentry organizations, and they would go and they would sit down in groups and meet with other people, and they would be okay, and there'd be some similarities because of course they had this shared experience of incarceration. But our clients always say, yeah, but I didn't belong there. You belong there. I didn't belong there. I shouldn't have been there. And it's only by being together and sharing their stories together that they can really help heal each other. So about a year ago, I was starting to really think about this, and I happened to get 2 emails in 1 week, one from a retired nun, one from a retired pastor. And I figured if anybody can help me figure it out, it's these guys. And so we started meeting together, and we had this idea of a peer-led group. And we were able to connect with a group here at the University of Pennsylvania, the Carceral Communities, which runs out of the psychology department, where they train folks who are reentering society to be peer counselors. And so we had one of our clients get trained as a peer counselor through Sister Honora. She was a Sister Mercy, so she connected us with Sister Mary at Project Home. And now we have a space at Project Home in the Honigman Center, which is a beautiful facility in North Philadelphia. And there's this very handsome gentleman who just walked in who just might know something about what I'm talking about, and he's not even looking up. So how you doing? So we had one of our clients get trained as a peer counselor, and now we run these peer support groups once a month at the center, and we provide whatever people need to get there. We'll provide transportation, we have food, we'll provide childcare, and make it easier for folks to come together. But it's such a beautiful community where people can be together and share their stories together and help each other. I think very importantly, I'm not in the room when those meetings happen. Our social worker is not going to be in the room, but it's really for these folks to meet together and work together. We're there as resources outside in case, but they're guiding the conversations, they're helping each other heal, and they are moving that process forward. And I have to say, we had a meeting a couple weeks ago, and you don't know this, Sean, but I was in tears right after you guys got started, because it just was such a beautiful thing to see you take such a wonderful role in working with people that you love, that we love, and really helping each other. And just the strength in that room, it just elevated me. And I'm just so grateful for you. And I'm so grateful for all those who went and are a part of that. And it is just such a magical thing to have. So I'm going to stop crying now and just stop.
Thank you, Marissa, and honestly, thank you for being emotional about the issue. I think they're all of the people that you have represented are fortunate to have all three of you. Certainly all the people in Pennsylvania, Marissa, are I know, indebted to you for the work you've done statewide for the cause.
Yeah.
So I'm going to turn around and open it up to you guys for questions. We do have a microphone. So we'll go kind of one at a time if you guys don't mind, but feel free to ask questions of anybody in the audience. Anybody? Yeah? No, we're videotaping, so you need to speak into the mic. My students, they're always exuberant.
Yeah.
If you could wave a wand and make one policy change that would make life better for those who wrongfully convicted, what would it be and why?
We're going to open that to all four of you.
Yeah.
Nobody gets off the hook.
So you want to go first?
Wow, that's a great question. Just one thing. One of the things I would like to see change, actually, and I got an update for y'all. I spoke about the 60-day rule. It saddened me when I was incarcerated to see so many people who I know was innocent to obtain evidence of their actual innocence that could exonerate them and not even have this evidence considered because the courts deemed them to be untimely. So one of the things that actually occurred was this 60-day rule with the aid of Marissa, and they're pushing and backing, have got this pushed to 1 year. So that's great, so that helps tremendously. But I like to see it like some states where there is no time limit. If you got actual claims of actual innocence, evidence of actual innocence, you should be able to bring it in any time, because you shouldn't be in the position that you're in anyway. So why is there a time limit on when you should bring this evidence? If a person sit on it for a year, I mean, why would you want to sit on that for a year? But if it takes that much time for you to develop it till you feel comfortable for you to file this before the court, then so be it. But it shouldn't be no restraint on when you should file that. So that would be the one thing I would like to see changed.
So I think it's a long list, so I've got to pick.
I know.
And it's hard, but I think one thing that would make a huge difference, particularly for people like Marissa who continue to do these battles every day, is that when you come to the district attorney or the attorney general, the prosecutor, and you say, we've done this investigation, it's exhaustive, and here is the evidence we have to show that our client is innocent, the default response should be, great, I'm going to take a look at this, and then if it's what you say it is, I'm going to agree that your client should be released. That should be the response. And that is a minuscule percentage of the response. The typical response, and that's the response that I had from the LA County District Attorney when we went to them in my client's case, was to tell us to get lost, and then we had to fight the case all over again through a 3-week retrial and 18 months. And that is typical, except that it's a rocket docket compared to what people normally have to do, which is suffer years of these pointless, stupid appeals and these technicalities that are weaponized against people, the way that Eugene was talking about. You're out, you're 61 days, you're 23 days outside, you're 2 hours outside. They don't even come to court and say, you know what, I consider these claims on the merits. Their first defense is to think of some procedural roadblock that your client failed to clear and to force your client and the attorneys to fight for years. And I think that it is reprehensible, and I think that it is fundamentally at odds with the mission of every prosecutor, and that is to do justice and to vindicate the truth, rather than stand on these absurd technicalities to allow people who are wrongfully convicted to rot in prison. And so if I could wave a magic wand, what I would do is I would remove those people after having them spend a week in solitary confinement so they can experience just one iota of what some of these folks had to go through. And I would replace them with people who fundamentally understand what it means to be not just a good prosecutor, but an ordinary prosecutor, which is to fulfill your ethical obligation. That's what I would do.
Aaron.
Yes, I love that.
So Laura kind of took my answer there. So I think that, I mean, the fundamental question about how to help people after they've been released is, to me, that assistance should be there immediately. Right? It should be immediate. That people should have housing. They should have access to jobs. They should have ability to get health care, family reunification assistance, and therapy, and really embraced as they're coming out. Because right now, just the isolation and the finger pointing that happens is just terrible. So to me, it's really how to try to get people to a place of wholeness as soon as we possibly can. Which is why these compensation statutes are so important, of course, but because they take so long, you know, they're not the answer. They're not the right answer. In Pennsylvania, where we don't have one, lawsuits are worse because it takes even longer, and is a huge waste of resources for what should be a better outcome. So to me, to really ensure we welcome people back into our society quickly, I would also have Google erase all history of that person, so that, because in the age of Google, there's no such thing as an exoneration or, you know, a clearing of a record, right? So I would have it all go, so you can't find out about it, and give that person the benefit and just the humanity of their own life back, and not be defined by the worst thing they've ever done, you know, been accused of doing, much less done.
What Marissa said, in terms of my real desire that this stuff come quicker and better for all these people, because our best solutions are always taking too long. My other answer, a more fundamental change, something I was talking about a little bit earlier, that's in our hearts, that's in our attitude, our acceptance that this is going to happen, that it doesn't mean it should happen, doesn't mean we shouldn't try and not have it happen, but it is going to happen, and that recognition will drive a lot of change. It will hopefully open the hearts of community members who will begin to recognize not just exonerees, but all formerly incarcerated people as not the throwaways, not the worst thing they've ever done, but people who are really in need of assistance in getting their lives together after a traumatic experience in prison, that will get us to make prison less traumatic and more rehabilitative. All the things that we want will be driven by, I think, honesty in saying, this is going to happen, in saying, this is what our prisons look like, and they shouldn't look like this. We're many of us angry at crime, but we don't need to remain angry at the people who we believe perpetrated the crimes in the way we are now. There's a lot of things we can do once we get ourselves aligned with, I hope, what our shared values across the political spectrum. I think that's the magic wand, because it's so incredibly hard to do. Brian Stevenson, now quoted 3 times, says, you know, as Marissa said, you know, you're more than the worst thing you've ever done. That is a message that is so long overdue to consider people in a broader context, not to forget, but to really ask important questions. That is the big battle, and I think it'll make a lot of the other things flow more easily once we get there. So that's the magic wand for me.
What John said.
Do you start the microphone?
Yes. Hi. I have a question about limits, time limits, because there's a lot of people that are not aware of when you're put in the system, there's a time limit for everything. They put a time limit on you. What can be done about time limits?
So, so for the time limits that, hi, Mrs. Moto. So for the time limits that we're talking about in Pennsylvania, like Jean said, we've now gone from 60 days to be able to present a claim to 1 year. And you know, it's still not enough. It's not even close to being enough. So, I mean, the answer of how to change it is, quite frankly, through the legislature in Pennsylvania, to convince the legislature that they're on the right path, but they need to go much, much further. And I'll share that in the negotiations for the legislation that we did get past the 1 year, the District Attorneys Association, even though they had agreed to it last year, came back and said, well, we can agree to 180 days. And when I said, well, why? What happened to the year? I didn't really get an answer, and I said, I feel like you just put this arbitrary number here so that you'll force me to negotiate against myself, and basically said, yeah, that's right. So we did get them up to the year once I used some language I probably wouldn't use in this room. But that it's still not enough time. It's just not enough time, because things change over time. Science changes over time, evidence changes over time, and we need that time. But the short answer is that's a decision for the Pennsylvania legislature to come to.
There are, you know, there are changes that are happening, and it's never as fast as you want, and it's never as broad as you want. You know, Texas has increased and now has an actual innocence cause of action, so that bar has been removed. They've also added a statute for people who were convicted under science that has now been discredited. And you know, sometimes in the Northeast we make fun of the states in the South, but you know, Louisiana has a compensation statute and Pennsylvania doesn't. Texas has done those things and we haven't. And I think, you know, when we start talking about legislative remedies, it's certainly not difficult for our legislators to look and see what other states are doing in this context. New York today changed their rules so that exculpatory information that could be used to prove the innocence of somebody you're investigating, they're now requiring that it be turned over 3 days prior to the acceptance of a plea bargain.
Right.
Before that, plea bargains could be accepted before the discovery deadline for turning over that evidence. Now we're changing that. So it's you people coming to things like this, it's these people doing the work that they're doing, and we will continue to make that progress. I'm sorry that we're chipping away, but it's better than not chipping at all.
John, you know me, and so do some of the people on the panel and other people around the room. My name is Mike McLaughlin. I had a run-in with a corrupt judge, Willis W. Berry Jr., 12 years ago. And I want to say something in general, a generality, because Lara touched on it. Prosecutors there to do justice. And to do justice means to do justice. And it's such an open-ended, ambiguous term. What does it mean to do justice? In my case, this judge was committing crimes, actually committing crimes as a judge, not allegedly, like he was doing it. And I know because I got him arrested. I got Kathleen Kane to arrest him, and maybe some of the people from California, you don't know who she is. She's sitting in prison right now. She's sitting in prison. Seth Williams is sitting in prison. My friend managed Seth Williams' campaign, and I couldn't get Seth to arrest Willis Berry because they're buddies. Berry was rigging cases. This is Judge Willis Berry, rigging cases. Again, rigging cases and taking bribes to throw cases against the prosecutors. So what happened was he had admitted he had committed crimes in what's called a judicial conduct board hearing. I'm book smart. I got accepted to law school, but I got knocked out of the box because of Berry. But I'm also street smart. So what happened was I used his, I served the Dukas Tecum upon his file. Make a long story short, I talked Kathleen Kane into arresting him. Now, did Kathleen Kane do it because she's a virtuous woman? I don't think so. She did it because she did not like Seth Williams. And so Berry got arrested. He's been convicted of 2 felonies. And today, I was just in court, April 1st. This is not an April 1st Fool's Day joke. I was in court in front of the Meek Mill judge. She doesn't want anything to do with me because everybody in the courtroom knows, and the Criminal Justice Center knows I got Berry arrested. So their mindset is like, we will never give him relief. He's right. He's actually right. You can't be a judge in committing crimes as you're adjudicating criminal cases.
Mike, do you have a question for the panel?
So my question boils down to, after my, I guess, 2-minute setup, how do you not turn your mind off? And getting back to what Lara said, prosecutors have to do justice. We have Larry Krasner. He's one of the most liberal DAs in the district attorney's history ever in this country. This dude will not give me the time of day. He will not help me with Berry because what have I done for him? Can I get him a sofa or plane tickets? How do you turn on to the DA's office to do what's right and vacate cases? This dude's committing crimes as a judge.
So I think,
how do you vacate the cases?
Marissa, is there, and Lara, since you have represented people with prosecutors, is there a technique that you have found for more useful than others for getting prosecutors to pay attention to cases of actual innocence?
Well,
No, that's my short answer.
so recently I've gotten really interested in this idea of, because you look at these case outcomes where you have pretty egregious misconduct by prosecutors or even judges, and oftentimes it goes unpunished. And so part of why is that, you ask? And it's because we have these ethics rules, but they're self-enforcing. So judges judge judges in terms of what's ethical and unethical, and lawyers judge lawyers. And because of that, we rely on a system of self-reporting. And what that means is, if you believe that someone has behaved unethically or, for example, committed prosecutorial misconduct, then you're obligated under the ethical rules to report that to the state bar. The judges are obligated and the defense attorneys are obligated, but no one ever does. And that is because we all swim around in the same cloudy fishbowl, which is to say that you are a repeat player in the system. So if you are to call it a prosecutor, you are exposing yourself and your future clients to retaliation. If you're a judge and you do it, you are jeopardizing your chances for re-election. And it's very, very difficult to do and hazardous to do. And so people don't. And I started thinking about this recently because I'm now an academic. And I thought, well, if these folks who are witnesses don't file, and litigants who are harmed if they do file are discredited as being disgruntled litigants involved in litigation, who's left? And I thought, well, what do we do as law professors, really? You know, we get paid a decent amount of money to give a lot of lectures and feel good about how smart we are. But wouldn't it be nice if instead we use some of our expertise and knowledge to actually do something? And so I actually started filing bar complaints. This is recent, so I can't tell you what my track record is, except that some investigations have been opened. But basically, I feel like I have some expertise in ethics and criminal law. I know misconduct when I see it. I'm going to dig around, dig up the record, and I'm going to file on you. And I'm going to file a complaint. And you're going to have to, I hope, take me seriously, because I'm not involved in litigation. I don't have an axe to grind. And I know a little bit about this, and I've read the record, and my complaint isn't just, you know, hand scrawling on a piece of paper, but I have citations because I have law students, people helping me. And maybe it's naive for me to think this, but my hope is that these complaints are taken seriously, and that when you document cases of prosecutorial misconduct, particularly but not exclusively in wrongful conviction cases, and you force the state bar to grapple with these allegations and hopefully to do the right thing and follow their own rules, perhaps there will be more of a check, and perhaps the prosecutor will think twice. before they bury that exculpatory witness statement. Perhaps they'll think twice before they excavate your client's A file and remove the information that they falsely argue to the jury is true. Perhaps instead of arguing false things in closing, they'll think twice because they'll think maybe there's a bar complaint coming down the pike that I will have to answer for. And so that's my own small way, I guess, of answering this question, which is I think that we have a responsibility, particularly people who have any sort of knowledge about the situation and are not jeopardized in our professional lives, to take some kind of action and at least try to make the levers function rather than not pull them at all.
Good job.
Yeah, I think it's funny, there are three groups of people that have what's called absolute immunity, which means they can't be sued for acting in their professional capacities. Prosecutors are one. Legislators who draft the laws have somehow managed to draft themselves absolute immunity. And judges are the third category because they also have codes that they can write. And, you know, John, you asked the question about, you know, why are we not allowed to get compensation for some of these things? Why don't we treat these cases the way we would treat other areas of the system where we allow civil litigation? And it's funny because, you know, in instances where, you know, there are cases where people are legitimately doing their jobs the best they can and we just get it wrong. Yep. There are also cases where people are not acting the way they should act and we have no recourse. And when there is no accountability in the system, it becomes impossible for us to go through a process of evaluating which is which is the intentional misconduct and which is the good faith mistake or error. And so, you know, the other thing that I would add to that is that it strikes me that there is no reason why prosecutors need greater legal protection than police officers. They get a heightened level of immunity, they get a heightened standard of protection because it is a difficult and dangerous job where they have to make rapid decisions, and we want them to do their jobs without feeling that they are going to be sued if something goes wrong. But it is not an absolute bar. It is not a bar that doesn't allow us to have some ability to investigate and understand what really happened. And I think that's another piece to the puzzle here.
It certainly is, and I think particularly in a state like Pennsylvania, where all the checks that are supposed to be in place to kind of prevent that, or at least to be able to suss it out if it happens, we don't have. So, for example, if you go across the river to New Jersey, in New Jersey, where you file an open file request in a criminal case, you can get the prosecutor's file, you can get the police file, not in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania exclusively prohibits the disclosure of anything to do with a criminal investigation. That could include crime scene photos, can include an ME's report, anything that's even objective. So it's not beyond the pale to think that it's quite possible for a prosecutor to intentionally not turn over information because there's really no risk that it would ever be discovered. And the cases where we have been able to get the prosecutor's file, we have not had one case where we haven't found information that is quite critical to the defense that has not been turned over. So we've, as a result, found cases where we know prosecutors intentionally lied to juries, lied and said that the witnesses who were testifying, for example, they came here with a clean slate, they didn't ask for anything. Meanwhile, in that prosecutor's file, there were letters from every single witness requesting a deal. They knew that what they were saying, that DA is now a judge in that county. So there's no way to get around that unless through some sort of diligent system, either through discovery or right-to-know laws or reduced immunity.
Some form of oversight is certainly needed.
Absolutely.
John.
One quick point and one clarification. Quick point is, look at how we've gotten away from what happens to exonerees after exoneration. It is so easy to get, this is what we think about, talk about. We're touching on accountability, so it has to do with something that happens after the wrongful conviction. But sort of our focus has shifted. I want to say something about lawsuits because it's something that blew me away when I first got involved, and it's something that is a persistent issue in public understanding. So indulge me a second here. Compensation statutes over here, lawsuits over here. Compensation statutes, you prove that you were in prison for something you didn't do, more or less, and you get something. Lawsuits, civil rights lawsuits, what are those? If you prove in the United States of America that you were in prison for something you did not do, you will get nothing in a civil rights lawsuit. You do not have a civil rights lawsuit. This is understandably bizarre in our system. How could there be a bigger civil rights violation than being in prison for something you didn't do and you just proved it, and the court says, Sorry. Why? Because the structure of our laws, until we change them, is that you have a civil rights violation when you prove that your harm came as the result, essentially, of bad action by someone who's working with a badge or by the state who is not immune. And so what we have are two very different remedies. They're incredibly different because if you were wrongfully convicted, it is not as if you can sue because you're wrongfully convicted. If you take all of the wrongful convictions, you have to look at the subset where there was bad action, the subset of that where you can prove it. Those people have lawsuits. That's a quarter of the people on the National Registry of Exonerations. So the rest of them, they don't have lawsuits to begin with. That's why there must be a compensation statute everywhere, because you should not have to prove blame. You just need to prove harm, right? That's what